First of all, a big warm welcome to all of you and I'm very glad on behalf of the Radio Festival to welcome you all as a part of our panel is the new story, the same story. But one thing that I'd like to say at the outset is that though we place a lot of emphasis on radio as a medium, and the entire idea of starting this festival came out of celebrating radio and the audio platform, we organically learned the role and the importance of podcasts and the podcasting space and not just in India but also globally. So, what to have you here with us, all of you who are doing such creative and tremendous work. We are really thrilled at the Radio Festival to have you all here. And I'm very glad that Prab could make the time to actually moderate this session, and she has played a very important part in also curating the session and suggesting some of the interesting work that all of you have been doing. So, a great, big, warm welcome from us here at the Radio Festival and loads of gratitude. And I'd like to kick off this session by formally introducing our moderator, Ms. Prabjeet Benz, and then I will hand it over to her to take it forward. So, Prabjeet is a producer in voice and AI at the BBC. She designs interactive audio experiences for smart devices and spends time thinking about the ethics involved. During her stint in India, she has produced several podcasts, including My Indian Life. So she is very well cued into the podcasting sphere and is a very creative person. And I really don't think we could have had a better moderator than her for this panel. So thank you so much for doing this, Prab. And yeah, let's get the party started.
Cool. Thank you, Nithika, for the lovely introduction and praises to the high heavens. I'm feeling very flattered right now. But yeah, no, thank you so much. And thank you for anybody joining us, listening in or watching this discussion. So, we're going to explore today, is the new story the same story? And we're going to do that in two parts. First, we're going to talk about the essence of Indian storytelling, and we're going to talk about the wider context. So secondly, we're going to talk about the implications the podcasts have on the industry and the implications of the industry itself on storytelling. And we've got a few protagonists and antagonists to help us answer this question. And what a talented bunch they are. I do love it when brown excellence gets together, even more so when it is on the topic of audio, a favourite of mine. And we've got a real variety of people here. We've got, producers, we've got writers, we've got, hard-nosed industry heads as well. And if we were to put a podcast together, I think it would be a cracker. But I'm going to introduce the panelists and give them a bit of a rapid fire round, to be honest. So I'm going to ask them to name drop their favourite Indian podcast and a very short description about their style of storytelling. So first of all, we have with us Nikesh Murali of the Indian Noir. Nikesh is a host, producer and editor of Indian Noir, a critically acclaimed chart-topping podcast of thrilling crime and horror audio stories set in India. So Nikesh, what's your favourite podcast and what's your style?
Yeah, my favorite podcast is Writer and the Geek, which is not a fiction podcast, but is a non-fiction one where they employ storytelling techniques to really break down very interesting topics like serial killers or historical aspects of previous pandemics or naval ships and naval warfare. So they're my favorite. And my style of storytelling, I suppose, is experiencing an enhanced audiobook. But I am the narrator. I also do the voice acting for the different characters. And I try to build in a cinematic structure in its writing and in the ambience that the listening experience creates. Yeah.
Nice. I personally would describe a little bit of your style as just as dark, like super dark. And I hope
people have said that before.
Fair. kind of also in tune with your background. But yeah, moving on to Surabhi. So Surabhi Bagga, of the Overthink Tank, is a comedian, a writer, and she's the force behind the podcast where comedians and celebrities get together. They talk about really deep topics and laugh at the things that keep us up at night. Surabhi, what's yours?
My favorite style, I think the podcasts that I personally like to listen to are true crime podcasts because, I mean, I've been a big fan of Criminal by Phoebe Judge, and it has, again, once kept me up at night. But just there's something about listening to like people getting murdered that puts me right to sleep, you know?
Wow, that's the first time I've heard that. I'm a little bit worried. I don't lie.
Don't worry, I'm taking help. But my personal style of storytelling is very like personal. I like to talk to people who, you know, tell their own stories. And even though I'm a comedian for my own podcast, I don't like to go for the joke. I like to go for the story, and I like to go for like, you know, the classic. I really believe in being vulnerable on your podcast, and I feel like that's really helped my personal way of storytelling. I feel like people connect more if I don't go for the joke and I complete my story. And I think the funny comes in that, which is why I think it's a comedy podcast. But I don't like to be funny. I want to tell stories.
Absolutely. And you know, I'm glad you're getting therapy, but it also seems like you're giving therapy, right? Always when I listen to your stuff, it feels very therapeutic, very soothing to the soul. Cool.
Thanks. That's the idea.
Ace. Well, you've definitely communicated it. Cool. And next we have Vineet of Storytellers and Story Sellers, which is his podcast hosted on IVM. And it brings together creators, artists, executives, marketers for a freewheeling conversation on the business of entertainment. And he's deep into content marketing in his 9 to 5. So yeah, Vineet, tell us about your favorite podcast.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. First up, my podcast, like you said, is about the business of entertainment. I realized very early in my career in entertainment that there are a lot of stories behind the story that gets put up that never get recorded, never get talked about. There's a lot of learning, a lot of wisdom, a lot of failures there to talk about, and failure is always fun to talk about. So I get people on to talk about their successes and their failures for others to learn from, right? I think there isn't a book for people to figure out what to do, how to do it, especially in entertainment. And I'm trying to sort of fill that gap with personal stories, wisdom, and those anecdotes, right? But that said, while my own podcast is non-fiction, so to speak, I love storytelling podcasts, man. I mean, I was recently went over Mission ISRO, the one that Harsha Bhogle narrates. I just went over it a second time around because, again, we seem to be remarkably poor, Indians as a culture, in documenting the cool things that have happened to us over the past few years. So I love the fact that someone like Harsha's voiced, I genuinely deeply love that. I also really like this podcast called Apocalyptic. Full disclosure, it's a podcast that my wife works on, but it's set in, it's the story of two girls who are dispatching broadcasts from a post-apocalyptic setup where everyone around you wants you to keep quiet, but then there are these two girls who are rebels. It's like thinly veiled political allegory. But again, set in like a post-apocalyptic dystopian nightmare.
I was going to say, is that post-apocalyptic or is that now? But anyway.
Oh. Yeah, it's called Apocalyptic. You should check it out.
Great. I love the pun. I love the kind of play on words there. And finally, I'd like to kind of go to Siddharth of Story Inc. Now, Siddharth is a serial entrepreneur. He's founded India's first story company. And what's that, you might ask? Well, Story Inc. is, in a year became a leading book to screen company. So they've got over 75 kind of screen adaptation deals. So Siddharth, what's your favorite podcast and what's your style?
Well, I love true crime, so I love all the gritty stuff and the dark stuff. I love shows like Chasing Charlie, The Daily Game Killer, and I also quite like Indian noir. It's fun, and so that's my personal choices. I run a podcast called Binchistan, which is talks about three friends talking about all things streaming, and it's casual, it's real, it's fun. So for me, my personal style is just to be real and casual and just chill.
Nice. I'm expecting some really good real talk from you a little bit later. Well, thank you so much, everybody. And I'm really excited about the kind of conversation that we're going to have, maybe touching a lot of dark crime, true crime stuff. But, hopefully kind of having a wholesome conversation. So just before we start, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. I would say actually it's a little bit more like ashram keeping, just because it's a little bit woo-woo. Well, what I want to do is ask us, all the panelists, to take a breath, and to bring consciousness to the stories that they tell today. Who you are, how you're telling that story, why you're telling it, and I'd like to draw your attention to the power that you have to give space, like you've done in your recommendations, but also to other panelists, right? And for people that are here and the people that aren't here. People like Bapu, actually. I'd ask you to indulge me for a moment while I kind of set the scene. Well, Bapu has a really long commute. He spends hours and hours every day on his commute. And on his commutes, he carries with him a little small box. And with that box is not only able to read the stories of others, he's also able to share his own. Now, you might picture Bapu to be zipping around a Delhi metro or stuck in Bangalore's traffic, or Mumbai traffic, some of you from there. He's in fact a Gavaria, a professional storyteller in Rajasthan, who travels from village to village by foot with literally a box, a wooden box, painted with miniature scenes from the stories of the Ramayana or the Mahabharata, or the story of his local legends. He tells his stories to kind of earn his daily bread and butter, and his father did that before him, and his father before him. And in fact, when they start telling the story, they trace their lineage to 400 years and to the time of the Ramayana itself. Now, India has a really long and rich tradition of storytelling, and I don't need to tell you that. But what's really interesting to me here is that tradition is steeped in oral stories in particular. And I really, really want to know how that rich tradition lends itself into the audio world today. Now, while Bapu, is not a relic of the past, he's still kind of, and people like Bapu kind of still trying to travel around India telling stories and reciting these epics as verbatim. Nikesh has kind of brought the Mahabharata kicking and screaming into the 21st century with a soundtrack that I might add that could easily be remixed into the Game of Thrones theme tune.
Yes.
In one of his series, the heirs of the Pandavas, amongst many other kind of true crime and kind of horror kind of series that he's kind of brought about. Now, Nikesh, what's your take? Is the new story the same story?
Yeah, look, I don't think the new story is the same story. You've raised some very interesting points about the history of oral storytelling, and mediums like books and movies and radio, they are new constructs. Oral storytelling was the dominant form of storytelling for a long time, and obviously India has a rich tradition of it. But even in India, where there's a real urge to sort of tag on to tradition and not let go of it, storytelling has evolved. And the stories that you hear from the panelists here and thousands of podcasters out there who are listening to this is a new story. And I just want to highlight from the outset, in terms of answering the session's question, what I think are 4 factors that lends itself to the old story becoming a new story. The first thing is that the golden age of TV has changed storytelling a lot. An audience that's been fed a regular diet of high quality SFX, VFX, big budget movies, incredible TV shows that could easily replay some of the greatest novels of the last century. They expect a finesse in terms of the story structure, which then is now finding its way into audio storytelling. I think the other thing is the nature of passive consumption of stories. It's not the old stories of your uncles and aunties and grandmas and grandpas that they used to sort of park in front of in the radio and listen to. It's the new kind of storytelling where it's a busy worker who turns up home and has to do millions of other things and is passively consuming a story. And is also a person who has very limited attention due to the social media age. So they expect stories to move at a very fast pace. So that's really evolved the way in which stories are told. Thirdly, I think that the new kind of story exists in a space where a lot of the gatekeepers have been completely eliminated. I don't have to deal with literary agents, editors, publishers, marketing departments, sales departments, not their timelines. I can write, record on Sunday, deliver next week. Obviously, once you get to a certain point in your skill, you're able to do it better, faster. But you are reaching niche audiences that want certain stories that are not produced by the leading creative houses because they either don't have the money or the balls or don't care about. Suddenly you have the audience for that. And finally, I think the intimacy factor is different. It's not similar to the intimacy that radio used to establish in Indian households. You have a different kind of box, from the box you're talking about, which is an intimate device which plugs into someone's ear and delivers your voice to them. And not just that, that box is a conduit to the life of the storyteller who has a social media account. So social media is very important for Indian Noir. Regularly, my listeners follow my life and engage with me through there. This was not possible once upon a time in radio. So I think these four factors have made the old story, this story, a more fine, superior, fast-paced, thrilling enterprise that is able to draw on all those traditions and deliver something that's very entertaining.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So how does that play out in your work? How does that play out in your process?
In my process, I mean, the first thing is in terms of the scripting, I follow a 3-act structure that they use in the movie. So on some episodes, I use a 5-act structure. For people, obviously, most people would know what the act structures are, but for those who don't know, it's a way of crafting the beginning, middle, and end of a story. So when I use that structure, my audience, which is fed on a regular diet of binge-worthy television, immediately knows how to latch onto certain story cues, certain narrative techniques, and they're able to follow along very easily. So that's one way in which it follows. It pans out. The other thing is the SFX that's used. It's just not enough to use your voice, although in Indian Noir there's a hierarchy wherein my voice is superior to the BGM, is superior to the SFX. That's how it's cut. But still, they do expect a very immersive audio experience. So you have to edit and cut them in a cinematic fashion. So I do that. I think lastly, also the packaging is very important. Visually, Indian Noir has a very clear social media identity. The darkness in the storytelling is reflected in the posts, not just in the design, but in the content, the kind of posts that are discussed, this kind of literature that's discussed, movies, the promos for the different shows. So that's how it reflects.
Interesting. So in terms of, there's that trope that there's only 7 stories out of the world and kind of like there's only a certain way to tell them, whether it's a 3-act structure or whatever. Do you find there's a difference between, you're a fan of like Lovecraft and kind of things like that, and do you find there's a difference between stories that you kind of are reinventing and the ones that you used to?
Look, the one thing that's really worked to my favor is that the Indian publishing industry and the general sort of cultural milieu has been very unkind to niche genres, which is a tragedy for a lot of people who write in that genre. We don't have magazines that can help young writers practice horror and then get into the top stage, and then it's nobody's fault. It's not the fault of the publishers or the literary agents because that ecosystem doesn't exist. They don't have manuscripts on that front. People don't want that. So everyone now then has to rely on the West. So I have come into a place where there is this vacuum of content, particularly literature that is written in the great horror traditions, Lovecraftian, Mackinean, and also even contemporary horror like Fear FM, which is one of Indian Noir's popular horror shows, is pretty much like the Insidious movies. It follows that, the psychic investigators fight off the monster of the month type thing. But there's not enough movies made by studios in that space. His Night Begins, which is the greatest hit on Indian noir, which gets fan mail. A fan mail appears once every 2 days. That's the rate at which people love it. It's a stock standard story. Revenge. Hitman goes on a revenge spree. I think 50 movies are made every year about that, but still, there hasn't been enough great Indian movies in that space. So really, yes, there are those tropes that for a Western audience it might seem like it's repeating the 7 plots, but to an Indian audience, it's a brand new day. And even now, even though this whole storytelling landscape is evolving, a lot of the cultural institutions, they are persisting with the same formulaic things and not experimenting enough. So which is great for me.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure kind of Siddharth and Vineet will have something to say about that as well in a moment. But before we go in there, I want to talk to somebody who does a lot of experimenting. Surabhi, does a lot of kind of writing, sketch writing, kind of, whether it's for stand-ups, whether it's for her podcast. But before we go into kind of Surabhi and her take on kind of storytelling, I just want to kind of really widen that definition of storytelling, because I feel like we can be purists and say, वो एक कहानी थी और एक बार ऐसा एक राजा था एक रानी थी, like all of that kind of scene. Let's just leave that to the side for a moment, and the purists will say there's got to be a beginning and a middle and an end, but actually we're not purists here, right? And I might go and say Oxford Dictionary definition of story is this, but actually if you draw the root, the etymology, the Latin verb is narrare, which is to tell, right? And even I looked up the Sanskrit kind of etymology, and katha is kind of, again, story, and it's telling and it's speech, right? And another twist on the etymology is gut, which is distress, right? So it's like gatin, right? Gatin, and I thought there's something really poetic in that, in the sense that stories are about tension and distress and relief, and that's your trade, Surabhi. So tell me about how you find stories and how you craft the Indian narrative.
100%. I totally agree that stories audio is one of the most intimate forms of media. And when podcasting became I think I started listening to Serial, and Serial was kind of it was my gateway drug to storytelling podcast. And it was just the best of true crime combined with storytelling, and it blew my mind. So I realized how not having a visual barrier can stories really seep directly into your brain. So it seemed like I was able to retain information for longer, and that somehow helps, because then you can go to parties and show off that information that you picked up from podcast. So I was really fascinated by audio as a medium, because it's easier to engage. People find it more relatable when you are directly talking to them in their brain. I don't know, there's some connection. But personally for me, what Serial did was that it kind of transported me into, what would it be like? There is this term that people talk about when they talk about storytelling. It's called narrative transportation. It's when you're watching a great movie, or you're listening to a very delightful podcast. You can build your own images in your head, and you can create your own production. And that's very, I don't know, it's very powerful, because you feel like you're building your own images, and it's kind of like a 360-degree experience. You could also, you can get things done while you're listening to a podcast. So for a productive, someone who's who dies to do things while I'm listening to a podcast, it's a beautiful experience to also listen to a fun true crime while I'm doing my dishes. So yeah,
multi-purpose. But I'm curious in terms of how you bring comedy into this. How do you bring the Indian experience into this? How does that play into your work?
I generally like to interview people who have had creative jobs, or one of my guests from my last season was an intimacy coordinator, and
what?
this is a real job. It's movie sets hire people to basically make sure that any romantic scene between two actors is properly spelled out, with every hand movement, with every okay, he's going to put his hand on your back, are you comfortable with that? So I really like interviewing people with interesting jobs, because it's fun to know what their daily life is like. And when you get to listen to their experiences, So yeah, I think that's somehow what I like to do. I like to interview people and their creative, how they look at their daily life.
Absolutely. There's a lot of anecdotes, right? So there's
Mm-hmm.
you pick a theme with your podcast and you kind of go off on these different directions around that theme and use people's kind of anecdotes and stories to highlight it. And one thing that you kind of mentioned is you don't always think about a punchline. You know, you like to kind of go off course a little bit. Tell me about that.
Yeah, that's something I think I wasn't like I wasn't doing this when I started my podcast. I was like, okay, I'm a comedian. I have to go for the joke. This is what people are in for. This is the comedy podcast. Because you know, as a stand-up comedian, also you hate silence. You hate when people don't like laugh. But I had to break that habit because I realized that uh, I wouldn't like it if someone like just like makes fun of my like dilemma that I send them. So it was kind of like needed it. I needed it to be like a more vulnerable space where people could talk about their lives and you know their little problems and other people can feel less alone in this while listening to my podcast. Because overthinking as a concept makes you feel very alone. It makes you feel like you're the only one doing this. And I wanted to like break that thing and I wanted to just say, you know what, I've been there too. It's not just you. So
Right. Okay. And have you found through those conversations, through the vulnerability, through comedy as a medium, that you're able to touch on more diverse topics? If so,
100%.
what kind of topics have you been unearthing?
One of the topics that I did last year was how to be a good friend to someone with depression. And that was something that I felt like it was kind of a topic that I needed to learn more about. So like podcasting as a medium, because I was a podcaster and I would produce podcasts also. So I would like do my research and it's just like it's a fulfilling process to like do your research and finally get to meet the people, interview them and ask the questions that people have sent you. So it's a very like, even though I don't have a storytelling podcast, but it feels like there's a lot of like parts that come together and that makes a very good episode. And yeah, it stays relevant for like years to come. It's not like something that has like no shelf life. You can listen to it tomorrow, you can listen to it next year. So I like that.
That's fascinating. And it sounds like your process as a podcaster is like one of humility, right? It sounds like you're using a lot of empathy and you're coming from a place of vulnerability yourself where you're saying, I'm not the broadcaster. हम नहीं बताएंगे आपको कि कैसे होना चाहिए. Like you almost like, hey, I don't know. Can you help? And that's a very different narrative, isn't it? That's really, really interesting. Okay. And Siddharth, you kind of have talked about applying, you know, that kind of global techniques to very Indian narratives, right? So whether they're, you know, narratives of, you know, young millennials being very vulnerable or, you know, your kind of like stories, you know, your kind of true crime type stories. What do you kind of see happening in that space? Do you think there's a specific type of Indian storytelling that does well?
Well, I think, for me, like, when I run a story company, I meet all kinds of writers, storytellers, filmmakers, right? And typically it's always been, if you want to tell a premium story, which can reach out to millions of viewers, you need to go to television and film and then OTT. But I think what typically happens because of the production budgets and the economics of the business, you have to pick the tent poles, you have to pick the cliched ones, you will gravitate towards the stuff that makes business sense to studio executives. And in that process, we don't tell relevant stories, we don't tell brave stories, we don't tell, most importantly, stories that need to be told to a certain generation of audiences. And I think YouTube kind of came as a savior a couple of years ago. But then YouTube has, I think, the advantage and the disadvantage of video. And I think the reason I love the audio format is because it just frees you from everything. The cost of voice, an original voice of a storyteller, narrator, interviewer, comedian, whoever it is, right, is so personal, it's so low that if you have something to say that's relevant, it can be said, it can travel. So I think the stories that will now come out from India will be relevant stories that need to be told. And they could be of any genre, any fiction, non-fiction, anything. But I think there are people that need to be heard in a more, I would say, curated fashion. And I'll give an example, right? The podcast that I run with my friends, it was a very casual, fun discussion about the stuff that we love to watch. Because there aren't enough podcasts in that space, so we just lucked out and we topped the charts. But I think it just is those times now that if you have something interesting to tell, and if you can figure it out, a format of telling it, you can just do it, and it will be heard. And I think that's the beauty of the times that you're in and the audio format. It's just so liberating. It's like freedom.
Interesting.
I can't tell you how much freedom is there on this format as compared to the video format in the business.
Really? So are you seeing those hierarchies kind of being dispelled or broken? Are you seeing that on an industry level? Are you seeing that on a personal level with the people that you interact with?
Well, I think at the industry level, we are still growing. It's still very early days for the industry in India. But I think at the personal level, in terms of the podcasters, the creators, the listeners, I think they're evolving very fast. I think the industry, as usual, as always, will lag behind, and that's fine. But the thing is, because the podcast is so, I would say, it's so easy to, there are no gatekeepers, right? So I think that because of that, the audiences will run, ahead of the business. They'll run a company. I think it's a great medium which will be driven by the individual storyteller, the individual listener. They will rule what's going to happen here, and I think that's the beauty about this.
That is fascinating. So it sounds like, here podcasters have an opportunity to set the agenda, to set the kind of conversations that they're willing to kind of explore and talk about, that kind of satisfy all those niches that we don't always see reflected on the big screen, because there's so many, like you said, big production costs and voices a lot on audio is a little less, or quite a lot less, right? Vineet, I'm curious about how you see this all playing out. Do you find narratives being driven by audiences or by creators? How does that Indian storytelling sit within that ecosystem of the digital world?
I think I'm sorry, there's azan happening behind me, so you're going to get a little bit of that. But I think it's a mutual ecosystem, right? If you're a bad creator, you're not going to get listeners, and listeners aren't going to stick around for people who are not evolving, right? I think what's very, very encouraging, and again, let me back up for a second, right? I'm going to wait till that's over.
I think it's a nice audio bed underneath.
Yeah.
Feel free to carry on. We can hear you loud and clear. Like Nikesh says, the voice is predominant, and that's all that matters.
Right. I'll tell you what. In India, we're spoiled for numbers because video dominates those numbers in a way that pretty much nothing else can, right? And it kind of stems from what Siddharth was saying earlier as well, right? Video can dominate that because the cost of producing video is massive. You want to produce something that reaches even 1 million views, either you've got to do it with the consistency of someone who's investing their entire life into it, or someone who's well capitalized, right? Audio changes that fundamentally. To your story about Pappu with the box, right? Audio is the medium for democracy, right? Audio is the medium for anybody who wants to create anything to start doing that, if just the intent is there, right? I mean, I would go so far as to say that audio is writing for the lazy, right? That's how it is.
Oh, I'm not so sure. I would argue saying actually writing audio is actually harder than writing a kind of story, and the writers in the room can back me up on this, but I just feel like
no, for sure. That's not to take away from writers at all. It's not it's not an aside to writers, but
but just in terms of audio, just to explore for a second, you can only put one concept per sentence. I feel like there's also the constriction in terms of the number of characters that you can include, the characters that you put in, in terms of audio retention, you can only have like a few characters that can have really strong personalities. Whereas when you're writing something, you can write run-on sentences, you can include many people and many settings, because people can always go back and read.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of what we've still been talking about earlier, attention spans are nowhere near where they need to be. So, it needs to be quite quick and, to the point. Nikesh is nodding his head, so I'm gonna.
Yeah. I just wanted to pitch it. This is not to counter Vineet's point either. this is just to generally talk to your point, Prabjit, about, so just to give you an idea, it takes 8.5 hours to produce 20 minutes of content for Indian Noir. But 3.5 of this is purely goes into writing and rewriting it and cutting it. But again, this is not to counter your point, Vineet, at all. But different, there are genres within podcasting where you don't have to focus that much on it. I agree.
No, but I'm going to
also
come
agree
in. No, I'm also going to come in and clarify what I meant by that. And let me offer you a paradigm here, right? Of course, I'm not saying that it doesn't take writing effort to put something together, right? That's not what I mean. But when I offer you the paradigm of Pappu, okay, the Rajasthani guy who's got 400 years of singing tradition behind him, he doesn't have 8.5 hours to write a 20-minute episode. He's got his craft, right? And all that guy needs at that time. And this is what has me excited about podcasting in general, not just fiction podcasting, is that democracy of access, right? It was rumored to be video that got you there, but video only got us to Kariminati. Yeah, that's a joke. That's what we get. So I'm happy about that. Yeah, but that's the thing. That's the power of audio, right? You can get started immediately. You can get started with what you're doing, right? All you need is someone to guide your hand, and then you can pick it up and run with it, right? What has me excited is not. I mean, of course, I love the episodes of Indian Noir that I've heard. I love what they're doing with the big podcasts that are well produced, but I really love what people are doing on the Pocket FMs of the world or the Hubhoppers of the world, right? There are writers coming out from the smallest of towns and simply having an audience of 2,500 people, right? 2,500 people. I've got that many on my Facebook. I don't care to respond to, right? But that's the thing, right? That's the power and the beauty that we're sitting on. For me,
I just want to interject, Vineet, and just add to your point. That's a very valid point. When you say 2,500, that's more than some of these literary magazines. And let me tell you, for 20 years, I've been published in a lot of snooty, high-end literary magazines, but not even their mothers will read it. Like, it's there, it's nice and flashy, it's got a nice little glitzy cover, it's been edited, but you'll be lucky if 10 people would have read it. And in fact, my most popular literary fiction story that's read widely is The Prostitute. And that's because people look for porn and end up on that page. So literary fiction,
literotica.
So you know what I mean. So 2,500 is a huge audience. That someone from a small town who has artistic abilities, literary abilities, can tap into and feel encouraged by. So
that's really fascinating. And Vineet, you've kind of touched on something really interesting there in terms of the kind of ecosystem and the platforms in which these stories live. So I could run you list where there's, Ghana or G7, the big players like Spotify and Audible moving into the space, and like the Indian platforms, right? The IVMs, the Sunas, the Hubhoppers, pockets of the world. But we're not going to delve into the statistics because I feel like the statistics in terms of the numbers change every quarter, right?
Very premature, yeah.
But I'm curious to see from your side, Vineet, what are you seeing? What kind of stories are the platforms hungry for, and what kind of stuff is performing really well?
I'm going to start with the least obvious, devotional stuff. India, devotional stuff. I don't know how or why. Let's talk about that for a minute. Yeah, for a second, that works, always works, right? Fiction storytelling, well done stuff, whether it's horror or mythology or true crime. That's doing very well. True crime, well, not fiction, but fictionalized, so to speak. That's doing very, very well. I do think that we're still discovering the language of podcasts for these platforms, right? I think we're still in transition from being generic audio to podcasts, right? And the difference there is generic audio has a very different beat to it, right? You've got news in the morning and business at noon, and then casual stuff in the evening and storytelling at night, right? That's generally how we've seen it happen. But we're seeing listener behavior which is very, very unique to consumption occasions, right? I think what's most interesting out of all of this is that we've lost the hegemony of the 22-minute episode or the 15-minute episode or the half-an-hour episode, right? So if you've got a good story to tell and it's something that can be told in 3 minutes, you're writing a 3-minute episode. If you're someone who's got a 22 or a 40-minute or an hour-long episode ready to go, that's what you're doing, right? So with all the genres that we're seeing, and with the sort of matrix of how long your episode can be, what topics it can cover, and stuff like that, the possibilities become infinite, right? So you're looking at someone who could be creating 2-minute horror or comedy for the listening occasion that is brushing your teeth, right? So people in the morning need to brush your teeth for 2 minutes. What can I put in 2 minutes, right? So it's a crazy world out there. And like I said, we're transitioning from audio to more podcast first, so you still have the hangover of the genres that have really worked, and if and the demand for that remains high, but it's a whole new world out there if you can think on your feet about how people would like to consume what you've got to say.
That's fascinating. So I think there's definitely a lot more thinking around kind of routine and habit forming kind of listening and those practices. In terms of a listening legacy, what is that? What kind of, do we inherit radio? Have we inherited, when I go out on CP and ask people, hey, do you listen to podcasts? They're like, no, but I do watch, Kunal Gamra chat on YouTube. So it's like, right. What is a podcast, right? And when do you listen to it is a really interesting exploration and kind of pattern that is yet to kind of establish itself and firm up. But in terms of Siddharth, you've kind of started to see, the traditional kind of like storytelling media start to kind of experiment with audio, whether that's, kind of Bollywood actors and, the Karan Johars or whatever, getting podcasts, and the Dhruv also, the influencers types. But then also, kind of, are podcasts becoming a hotbed for experimentation that is getting picked up by these industries? When I say industries, I mean TV, film, etc.
Yeah, so like the company that I run the storying is basically a book-to-screen company, and it's basically book rights. I sell them for video. Now, books, especially in India, the reading audience is not as large. So it tells the concept, but it's still not large enough. What we're hoping is that the audio industry is a larger audience than the reading audience. And if that can be a great testing ground for certain stories, then they can go to video with more confidence. So I think it's, in my personal opinion, I think the podcast industry will be a great hotbed and a great springboard for a lot of stories and storytellers to go to video. And that's really the most exciting bit for me, because coming from video, I see audio as a great, cheaper, cost-effective way to experiment. And, yeah.
I was going to say, have you started to see that happen? Has that already happened yet? Or is that...
No, I think we're in early days, but, we're in the process of, doing that this year. So I think by next year, we'll know the results. Also, the other point that I want to add is that also what we're doing is a lot of genres which seem risky for video. And even if they're books, they can come to audio, not like audio books, but, like adapted books. So like, we control the rights of hundreds of such books. And then they give a voice and a platform to those stories. So I think as an industry, I think the audio industry, the podcast industry can be a great asset for the video industry at large. And I think the moment that happens, it will trigger capital inflows. It will trigger more investments in the business. And I think it should grow together. So I think it's moving in the right direction, in a positive direction.
Interesting.
Yeah, if I can add to that point as well, like for Indie Noir, there are a lot of conversations happening on that front for transitioning into the OTT space in particular. But it's been very interesting to me that a lot of those inquiries are happening from Hollywood, from the people who can then latch onto producers in LA, but not enough from our home. So I think when the Siddharths of the world will transition an Indian podcast into movies or OTT things, I think that's when the big movement will start happening. I think right now it's just individual investors thinking, but with someone like Siddharth, for example, he has curation experience. He's worked in that space a lot. He might be able to pick the right kind of product to push onto a platform like that, which then becomes a big success, which then opens a floodgate or another channel for the economy. But in addition to that, it's very interesting to me that I think the biggest compliment I have received for Indie Noir is that it's put people off binging TV and they want to binge on the episodes. That's fantastic. I think that's what success. But that's not my point. My point is, then immediately people say, this would make a great movie. I think because of the small size of the book publishing audience and just the way publishing is structured in India, and generally people being so attuned to the visual medium, they're immediately wanting to watch a movie version of something they have spent 15 hours listening. They really want to see the video version of it. Yeah, so that's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of Siddharth, when you've got that kind of producer's eye and that curatorial experience, what is it that you think translates well? Because Nikesh is like, well, actually, I've put in the hard craft. I've actually created something that is, voice first and audio first, and really the horror of something. I know you've mentioned this before. Sometimes when you see the monster, you're deflated. You're just like, huh? It's not even scary anymore. And sometimes the imagination is so overactive. When I think of the first series that you did, I have the very vivid picture of what the monster looks like. So Siddharth, are there certain formats that actually lend themselves to the visual storytelling?
Yeah, for sure. So for example, take Indian noir, for example, right? I think crime, horror, I think these lend very naturally to more imagination on the video side, on the visual side. So the moment somebody hears something, he'll say, you know what, I can imagine it differently for the audience. And that's what will inspire a producer and a director and a filmmaker. So I think, these genres are naturally, they have a lot of elements that work for video and visual. So I would say those ones will be the first ones to really jump. And I think we're just a year away in India. And I mean, Nikesh, I can tell you 6-12 months from now, you'll be flooded by calls from Indians. It's just that as always, right? The Indian executives are lagging behind all the time on anything that's exciting and new. And we always play catch up. But that's cool. I think, it gives us time to prepare. I think this is a great year to prepare, experiment, platform as much as one can. So that when, everybody's watching, I mean, from the industry, you've got enough stuff to pick from. So this is really that year.
You look like you want to say something, right?
Yeah, I wanted to come in on this, but I'll wait for Nikesh to finish.
I just actually wanted to talk about something that Vineet was talking about before in terms of how platforms look at different genres. It's very interesting. In my conversations, I find that some of the bigger platforms, and something what Siddharth was talking about as well in terms of Indians sleeping on certain things, I think a lot of platforms are really sleeping on fiction as a genre. The conversations always tend to, we've got 5 other celebrity-led talk shows which are going to bring us, which is true, it's going to bring in the numbers. But I think they are not really looking at the fine metrics of some of the things. So to give you an example, when Trishul, Indian Noir's military thriller was recently launched, there's not much writing happening in that space. There's not much. There's Uri, the surgical strike. That was a good movie, and that movie. That's not enough. You watch it for 2 hours and it's over. So there's just such a hunger for that content. Just over 3 days, downloads jumped by 2,900%, and then in 2 weeks it jumped by 5,900%. People are just sleeping on these metrics of what people want out of their entertainment. So that kind of looking down upon some of the genres is just I find that very strange. But then I'll just finish off. Won't take too much more time. Just to tie up with what Siddharth was saying in terms of how it's useful as a medium for TV producers. Books, it's very hard to test how a scene works. A lot of these books have 10 pages unnecessarily before something happens that kicks off the story. Whereas in a audio story, things are happening constantly, but forget that. The microstructure of a scene. So for example, I will write till I make myself cry to see if a scene actually can make people cry. You can test out these things a lot better in audio. Like the finale for His Night Begins is a good example. I rewrote the finale till I cried 2 or 3 times. So you can really test that. And then when you go into a pitch meeting, you are more superiorly confident than any screenwriter that they've brought along or their story group, in terms of the emotional content of it. But I will stop now.
Vineet?
I think it's brilliant that you say that. And before I start talking about a couple of things that I want to mention, I think the core of any good writing, whether it's television, whether it's audio, is the rewrite, right? So if you're not putting in the rewrite, it doesn't matter if your core material or source material is a hit or flop. When you try and adapt, it's going to suffer. I think there are 2-3 things that I wanted to bring up. The pathway from podcast to screen, I think, has become more and more well trod. I mean, in the past few years, it started with Amazon doing Modern Love and a bunch of others happening internationally. I think the one that I took a lot of pride and joy out of was when Song Exploder went from like an audio, like a podcast, to a Netflix original. So Song Exploder, there's this guy called Rishikesh Hirve who sits down with artists and talks about one of their songs and really explodes the song. So that's one. I think Pratilipi has a writer who's done this beautiful story called My Name Avantika. I think that's the name of the story, and she's got picked up for movie rights as well. So that pathway is getting trod better and better. I think what it's doing is breaking the access problem that we've had, right? I think in general, India has Indian screenwriting especially has always had a sourcing problem, which tend to source our stories from the same sort of cohorts and the same locus usually. But with more original audio writers, I think you're getting a trained crop of people who know how to set up a scene, who know how to go from point A to point B into a story, who know how to bring it back. So that I think we're chancing upon a very solid crop of writers to come in. I've completely forgotten the other thing that I want to talk about. It'll come back to me.
We can touch on, so we're kind of edging towards the end now, so I kind of want to wrap up a bit. So Sophie, did you have any thoughts on kind of that?
Yeah, I remember, like, I feel like this whole thing of like taking a podcast and making it into a show or like a movie will also open the room for debate of like, what is better? Is the podcast better or the movie? Which is a take on the classic, is the book better or the movie? I feel like that would be interesting, because then if the whole thing is to like, go from one genre, but like make it better in the next one, I think that will also be interesting to see. Because in Homecoming, when they made that show from that podcast, it was pretty interesting because people were fighting on Reddit about like how this scene sounded much better on podcast, but like when you watched it, it was very underwhelming. So I feel like there will be a lot of like debate around this, and this will be exciting to see.
Fascinating. Cool. So I guess what I wanted to do is throw open the last question. Kind of we've seen, Instagram has changed the way rappers present themselves. They now tattoo themselves for more likes, right? We know that audio streaming services have changed the nature, the structure of the song. People are, creating the hit so that the hook is in the first 10 seconds. Has, streaming and podcasts, is that changing the way we are telling our stories? Just a quick fire one on that one, if anyone's got any input.
I'll go first. Most definitely, I think we're only just scratching the surface with what consumption technology can do for us, right? Over the years, what we've seen is the power of production technology really change how we're creating. So whether it's the camera, whether it's transmission, whatever else. Now the power is in the hands of the consumer, right? And I think, Prabjit, with your interactive audio stuff as well, you're using that a lot too, right? I think that's going to completely change what's possible to do. Today, when you're listening to a podcast on Spotify, it may soon be possible to do choose your own ending. It may be possible to do collaborative listening. It may be possible to do sort of distributed storytelling, right? So we're only scratching the surface at this point, right? And what I've really learned is that if there is a compelling story to tell and or a compelling storyteller, people will spend their time, right? I think it's a myth. The attention economy is a myth. The people don't have short attention spans. You're not telling your story right? The same generation is spending 8 hours, 10 hours binge watching stuff on end. They will watch something in 3 days, and then you're saying they don't have time to watch your or listen to your podcast. I think there's some innovation required there, but we're just scratching the surface. I think a lot more to follow.
I think you're absolutely right there, nail on head. And that ties back with the conversation that, Siddhartha, were saying about, when they're trying to figure out whether something's ready for adaptation, the quality of the storytelling is what they're looking for. Because when the storytelling is really good, then you can see it. You can see it in your mind, you can engage with it, you can laugh and cry to it, but you also can see it in screen, and you can see it playing out in so many different ways. So that's really, really interesting. Well, to kind of conclude today, what I want to do is to kind of finish with a yes or no question, really. So is the new story the same story? And I'll start back with the beginning with Nagesh. Yes or no?
No, it's not. I know you said a yes or no, but just quickly, I think the visual medium has had such an impact on the audio storytelling space, and then now the audio storytelling space has blossomed into something amazing. So it's a new space.
Cool. Surabhi?
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. I don't think so. I feel like things are evolving, and even storytelling is also evolving. So yeah, I don't think so. No.
Okay. And Vineet?
I'm going to say yeah, no.
That's a valid answer. That's a complete. Let's not be binary about this.
Yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that.
Siddharth?
Well, for me, there's no old story, there's no new story. It's all, I think this is the best time to tell stories, especially in this country, in India. So
I like that.
I'll leave it at that.
Let's not be linear. Let's be cyclical. Let's break it all down. I like that. Cool. Well,
absolutely.
Thank you so much. And I guess there's one thing that I didn't tell you. Bapu didn't always have a box. Bapu and the Gavrias aren't just tradition. They were innovators in their time. Before their box, they had cloth. They would write or paint stories on this cloth. The cloth would disintegrate and it would fall apart, get ruined in the rain, and those stories would be lost. So he had to find something a bit more sturdy to keep hold of those precious stories. It might have been a bit clunky and a bit difficult to get hold of and to master the painting, but he made the transition. And I think that's our job too. We're transitioning the mediums of storytelling. Like cloths and boxes, devices will come and go. Good stories and our voices are the one constant. We have a chance to move to a new medium. We've been given the gift of a treasure trove of stories to tell, and we should use the greatest tool in our box, our voice. And the best bit is, you get to decide whether the stories we tell are old, new, or cyclical. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prabhu. Thank you.
Thank you, Prabhu.